So the broad research question is, how does international migration affect the lives of both migrants and the local population? Like in the past, in the future, millions of people will be displaced by wars, by civil conflict, by economic and natural disasters. And much will depend on how potential receiving countries, how they react to these situations. And we believe that how they react will partly depend on what they expect to happen when they admit refugees and international migrants. And these expectations depend on what they see has happened in the past. There are many international migration episodes one could study. One could go back 150 years ago and study what happened in the United States when the Europeans emigrated massively there. Or one could look at what happened in Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Jan Nimzig and I, we look at what happened in West Germany just after World War II. Millions of people from the East arrived in West Germany in what would become West Germany in 1949. And we're trying to understand what were the economic consequences of that for West Germany in the long run. So the scientific challenge when studying the long-run effects of international migration is that ideally one would like to have two places that are comparable in socio-economic terms, and one place receives immigrants or refugees and the other place doesn't. Now, that is rarely the case in actual historical episodes. And the reason is that migrants, they have an incentive to look for places that have better prospects for them. If they cannot do that, then that's because they're restricted to settle in places that are not that great. These two factors make that rarely we get a situation of two comparable places, one receiving immigrants and refugee and the other not. How the scientific challenge can be addressed depends on the actual historical episode that is being studied. Jan Nimzig and I, in our studies of the refugees arriving in West Germany after World War II, we use a feature of post-war German history. After World War II, Germany, until 1949, was divided into 4 occupation zones. The French occupation zone restricted the access of refugees. The consequences of this are very clearly visible if one looks at the border between the French occupation zone, which restricted access of refugees, and the US occupation zones, which admitted refugees. And Jan Nimzig and I, we focus on the border between the French and the US occupation zone within the present-day state of Baden-Württemberg. What we do is we consider villages or towns that are very close to each other. They are in close proximity. But one town or village is in the US occupation zone and another one is in the French occupation zone. What we find is that the villages in the US occupation zone, they received a lot more refugees than the villages in the French occupation zone. Before World War II, before the occupation zones, before the refugees arrived, they looked very similar in socio-economic terms. So we have the situation of two comparable places, and we can go on to analyze the long-term economic consequences of that. So to understand our findings, it's useful to go back to the 1950s, to the year 1950. This is 1 year after the occupation zones were dissolved. There is no occupation zones anymore. There is no occupation zone border anymore. Now we look at these villages, and what we find is that the villages and towns that are in the former US occupation zones that did let in refugees, those villages and towns have a 20% higher population density than the villages and towns in the former French occupation zones. Interestingly, that difference in population density along that former border, it persists in time. So the question is, why is that the case? One explanation would be that maybe on the former US side of the border, housing is cheaper. Maybe more housing was built in response to the arrival of the refugees. But we find that housing is more expensive on the former US side of the border. So we have a situation where we have a denser population on the US side of the border, and at the same time, housing there is more expensive. There are more people where housing rents are higher. There are good reasons why people sometimes live in places that are denser, that have greater population density, and that are also more expensive to live there. Take cities, for example. Cities have high population density, and they have higher housing rents. People still live there, and the reason is because productivity and wages generally is higher in cities. What are the reasons for that? Why is productivity higher where population density is higher? Economists describe the group of reasons for that under the term agglomeration economies. Agglomeration economies are, for example, that in places where population density is higher, there is a greater supply of differentiated, different services and goods. There is also a faster circulation of ideas. And it's also the case that firms find a more diverse and larger workforce, and workers have more employers to choose from. All these factors make population-dense places more productive. Are agglomeration economies the reason why today we find that on the former US side of the border, population density is higher? We think that that is true. There is evidence pointing in that direction because we find that on the former American US side of the border, productivity, wages, and income per capita are also higher. There could be other explanations for the differences in productivity, wages, and income per capita that we find along the former border today. The most compelling ones have to do with other policy differences between the American and the French occupation zones. For example, it is known that in the French occupation zone between 1945 and 1948, for the 3-year period, official food rations were smaller than in the US zone. This could have had long-run effects on the health of people that grew up in the former French occupation zone. It's also known that industrial policy in the French zone was different than in the US zone. We investigate these alternative explanations and we find very little evidence for them. Our research is about a specific episode of international migration, and it has to be seen together with other studies of the European emigration to the United States. There are studies of emigration to Argentina, to Brazil. There are studies of immigration in 18th century Prussia, in the Ottoman Empire, and there's other studies of the refugees that arrived in Germany after World War II. So far, the economic effects of international migrations have been positive for the migrants, but also for local populations. Migration, international migration, and how to deal with it will continue to be a very important topic. We also have climate change that is expected to displace millions of more people. So we need to continue to study all migration episodes that we can get our hands on. We need to study the Syrian refugee crisis. We need to see what happens now with the ongoing Ukrainian refugee crisis. We need to find out about the facts so that we go away from subjective beliefs and from prejudices about what the economic effects of these migrations are.